So, you're me when I was little. And where are you off to, dressed up like that?
Where do you think you're going, Beaver? To Europe?
The 1980s are often remembered for excess. Big hair, bright colors, designer jeans, and the emergence of the yuppie culture.
Ask most yuppies here about saving money, and they'll tell you.
I don't have enough money to save. I don't make it.
MTV was showing off lavish lifestyles, and movies like Wall Street were celebrating wealth. But for millions of American families, the 80s looked very different. Poverty in the 1980s had its own unique characteristics that were shaped by the era's economics, government programs, and cultural attitudes. Ronald Reagan's presidency brought significant changes to welfare programs and social services, which affected how poor families lived day to day. What made being poor in the 80s weird wasn't just the lack of money. It was how poverty intersected with the rapid cultural and technological changes of the decade. You had one foot in the old world of making do and mending, and another in a new world of consumerism that was increasingly leaving you behind. There was also less digital divide because the internet didn't exist yet. So, in some ways, poor kids and rich kids consumed the same TV shows and radio stations. But in countless other ways, the gap was obvious and often embarrassing. So, let's take a look back at 20 weird facts about being poor in the 1980s that shaped how an entire generation grew up. Fact 1. Government cheese was actually a thing. If you grew up poor in the 1980s, there's a good chance you ate government cheese, an actual 5-pound block of dense, bright orange cheese wrapped in plain packaging and handed out through federal commodity programs. It existed because the government had purchased massive dairy surpluses to support farmers, and instead of letting the stockpile go to waste, they distributed it to low-income families. The cheese had a unique flavor and texture that everyone who tried it remembers vividly. What made government cheese especially strange was how it became a recognizable symbol of poverty. If someone spotted that big orange block in your refrigerator, they knew your family was receiving assistance. Yet, despite the stigma, many people genuinely liked it. It melted beautifully, making legendary grilled cheese sandwiches, macaroni and cheese, and casseroles that store-brand cheese could never quite replicate. Distribution days were memorable too. People lined up at community centers, churches, or warehouses to pick up their monthly commodities. Not just cheese, but powdered milk, canned meat, butter, and other surplus items. By the early 90s, these programs faded as food stamps became the main form of assistance. Still, for millions who grew up on it, government cheese remains an unforgettable symbol of poverty, resilience, and life in Reagan-era America. Fact 2. The Sears catalog was your shopping mall. For poor families in the 1980s, the Sears catalog wasn't just a book of products. It was a wish list, a form of entertainment, and the closest thing you'd get to a shopping spree. The massive catalog would arrive in the mail, and kids would spend hours flipping through the toy section, circling items they hoped to get for Christmas or birthdays. The catalog was democratic in a way. Rich and poor kids alike could look at the same pages and dream about the same toys. But for poor families, the catalog served a practical purpose too. When you couldn't afford to drive around to different stores or didn't have transportation, the Sears catalog let you comparison shop from home. You could find the cheapest options, plan your purchases, and even use the layaway program that Sears offered. Layaway was huge for poor families because it meant you could reserve an item and pay it off gradually. Many Christmas presents were bought this way, with parents making small payments over months to ensure their kids had something under the tree. The weird part was how the catalog created a shared cultural experience despite economic differences. Every kid in America basically had access to the same Sears catalog, so you'd be talking about the same toys and clothes at school. But while some kids would get the expensive Huffy bike with all the accessories, poor kids might get the basic model, or, more likely, a used bike from a garage sale that didn't appear in any catalog. The Sears catalog represented both possibility and limitation. It showed you everything that existed in the world of consumer goods, while simultaneously reminding you of everything you couldn't afford. When Sears stopped printing the catalog years later, it marked the end of an era that poor families in the 80s knew all too well.
The catalog stores were closing. Then Sears stopped the big book in 1993.
Fact 3. free lunch tickets were color-coded. Shame school. Lunch in the 1980s was often a daily reminder of a child's economic status, thanks to a system that made poverty visible to everyone. Many schools used different colored tickets or punch cards to distinguish who received free or reduced price lunch. Full price lunch might use a white ticket, reduced lunch a yellow ticket, and free lunch a pink one. Every day when you handed over that ticket, everyone in line behind you instantly knew your family's income level. The strangest part is how normal this seemed to adults at the time. There was no privacy, no subtlety, and no attempt to protect kids from embarrassment. Some students tried to hide their tickets in their palms, while others skipped lunch entirely to avoid the stigma. In some schools, free lunch students even had separate lines or different serving times. The free lunch program genuinely helped millions of children by ensuring they had at least one nutritious meal a day. But the way it was implemented showed little awareness of the emotional toll of publicly labeling children as poor. For many who grew up in the 80s, those color-coded tickets remain among their most humiliating memories. Today, most schools use uniform electronic systems that conceal who receives assistance. But the kids who stood there holding a pink ticket will never forget what it felt like to be marked as less than in front of their peers.
Having them be energized for the day ahead of them, and parents don't have to worry about sending their kids with food.
Fact 4. You wore your siblings' old clothes in reverse order. Hand-me-downs have always existed, but in the 1980s, wearing your older siblings' clothes took on a strange dimension because fashion was changing so quickly. The decade saw styles shift dramatically from year to year. So if you were the youngest in a poor family, you might be wearing late 70s fashions in the mid-80s, or early 80s clothes in the late 80s. Showing up to school in outdated clothing was unavoidable, and everyone noticed. The weird part wasn't just that the clothes were old, it was that they carried the identity of your siblings. If your older brother had been known for a particular jacket, inheriting it meant you were now associated with him. Classmates would point it out. "Isn't that Mark's jacket?" You had no choice. Your wardrobe came preloaded with someone else's style, history, and reputation. Families also participated in hand-me-down chains with relatives and neighbors, sorting through bags of clothes that varied from nearly new to worn thin or stained. Girls struggled more, since 80s fashion was trend-driven, so wearing older clothes could make you look out of step. Boys fared slightly better with timeless jeans and t-shirts, but hand-me-downs never fit perfectly, were faded, and always carried the ghost of the sibling who wore them first.
You see, we knew if we dressed too good, even the girls got jealous.
Where do you think you're going, Beaver? To Europe?
Fact 5. Generic products. Had black and white labels. The 1980s saw the rise of generic products, and poor families bought them almost exclusively. What made these items weird was their deliberately plain appearance. Generic goods came in stark black and white packaging with nothing but the product name, cornflakes, cola, or paper towels. No brand names, mascots, slogans, or colorful designs. Just the bare minimum. Walking down the generic aisle felt like entering a different dimension, where all the fun had been stripped from shopping. The trend took off in the early 80s, with entire supermarket sections devoted to these no-frills products, priced 30 to 40% lower than name brands. For families on a tight budget, buying generic wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Having rows of black and white boxes instantly marked your pantry as belonging to a poor household. Taste was another odd factor. Some products were fine, but others were noticeably inferior. Soda could be flat, cereal stale, cookies dry and flavorless. Families quickly learned which items were acceptable, but sometimes there was no alternative. The visual impact was striking. Opening your cabinets revealed identical, drab packaging, contrasting sharply with the colorful variety in middle-class kitchens. By the 90s, generics evolved into store brands with better design, but in the 80s, plain packaging was unmistakable, and unmistakably a sign of poverty.
The next time you're shopping the dairy case, consider generics. Now you have a choice of savings.
Fact 6. Powdered. Milk was a kitchen staple. If you grew up poor in the 1980s, you probably drank powdered milk, and probably hated it. Powdered milk was a government commodity and a cheaper alternative to fresh milk, which was expensive and spoiled quickly. Boxes of the powder were mixed with water to create a substance technically called milk, but it was thin, slightly off-flavored, and left a chalky aftertaste. Despite this, it was a staple in poor households. What made powdered milk especially weird were the strategies families used to make it tolerable. Some mixed it with a little real milk, others refrigerated it overnight. And many kids only drank it as chocolate milk to mask the taste. Some families used it exclusively for cooking or cereal, saving real milk for drinking. Every household had its own system. Powdered milk also carried social stigma. Inviting friends over meant deciding whether to serve the off-tasting milk or claim you were out. Kids learned to spot it instantly at friends' houses and often refused it outright. More than just a beverage, powdered milk symbolized 80s poverty. You had the same items as wealthier families, but in inferior forms. Milk was powdered, food was generic, clothes were hand-me-downs. Finally, being able to buy fresh milk felt like a small but meaningful upgrade in quality of life.
Without needing refrigeration, proving especially valuable in areas where fresh milk is hard to come by.
Fact 7. You shared a bedroom with multiple siblings. Privacy was a luxury that poor kids in the 1980s rarely experienced. Many shared a bedroom with one or more siblings, and sometimes even shared a single bed. Bunk beds were common, but so were arrangements where multiple kids slept in the same full-size bed. The weird part wasn't just the lack of space. It affected every part of daily life. Sharing a room meant there was no private spot to think, read, or just be alone. Teenagers had no escape during the years they craved privacy most. You'd be trying to do homework while your sister watched TV or talking on the phone while your little brother played on the floor. Emotions had to be quietly managed so you didn't disturb anyone. It also limited where you could have friends over. Bedrooms were full, living rooms were often occupied, and small apartments or houses offered little extra space. Many kids spent free time outside or at friends' houses, marveling at the luxury of private rooms. Sharing a bedroom shaped sibling relationships too. Constant proximity could create closeness or rivalry. Conflicts over posters, drawers, bedtime, or snoring were unavoidable. For many who grew up this way, one of the first adult goals was a room of their own, a private space to finally have control and solitude. Fact 8. The TV repairman was essential. In the 1980s, televisions were expensive investments that poor families couldn't easily replace. When your TV broke, you didn't just go buy a new one. You called the TV repairman. These were specialists who would come to your house, open up the back of your television set, and repair whatever was wrong with it. They'd test tubes, solder connections, and adjust components until the picture came back. The weird thing about this was that it's completely unimaginable today. Modern TVs are essentially disposable, but in the 80s, you repaired them. For poor families, keeping the TV working was crucial because it was often the primary form of entertainment. There was no internet, no streaming services, no video games, unless you were lucky enough to have a Nintendo. The TV was everything. It was how you watched Saturday morning cartoons, how you kept up with the news, how you spent evenings together as a family. When it broke, you felt that loss immediately. Some families would go weeks without a working TV, while they saved up for the repairman or waited for a part to arrive. The TV repairman was usually a local small business owner who knew his trade inside and out. He'd show up with a toolbox full of specialized equipment and spare parts. Kids would watch in fascination as he worked, seeing the guts of the television exposed with all its wires and circuit boards. Sometimes he could fix it right there, and the relief when that picture flickered back to life was genuine. Other times he'd have to order parts and come back later, which meant more waiting and more saving to pay for the final bill. What made this weird in retrospect was how much technical knowledge these repairmen had. They understood how televisions worked at a fundamental level, and they could diagnose problems by watching the screen or listening to sounds the TV made. This was skilled labor that has essentially disappeared, because modern TVs are too complex and too cheap to repair. But in the 80s, the TV repairman was an important figure in poor neighborhoods, keeping families connected to their primary source of entertainment and information. Fact 9. Commodity food boxes. were monthly events beyond government cheese. Poor families in the 1980s often relied on federal commodity food boxes. Once a month, you'd visit a distribution center, usually a church basement or community center, to pick up a box filled with surplus government food. These boxes contained a strange and random assortment: canned meat, peanut butter, canned vegetables, rice, pasta, powdered eggs, and, of course, the famous 5-pound blocks of cheese. Everything came in plain, institutional packaging, and much of it required creative cooking to make it edible. The experience of picking up commodity boxes was unusual too. Families stood in long lines alongside neighbors, sharing both the shame and solidarity of poverty. Kids helped carry the heavy boxes to the car, and then it was up to the household to store and plan meals around whatever had been provided. What made these boxes memorable was how they shaped daily eating. Diets weren't based on preference or taste. They were dictated by whatever was in the box. Moms became resourceful, stretching peanut butter, canned meat, rice, and beans into casseroles, stews, and inventive dishes. Some recipes turned out surprisingly good, and many families still carry forward meals that originated from figuring out how to make government commodity foods work in the 1980s. Fact 10. You knew every free activity in town. Poor kids in the 1980s became experts at finding free entertainment. You learned which days the public library had story time or movie screenings, when the community center offered open gym or crafts, and which parks had the best playgrounds. You also knew which stores would let you hang around without buying anything. With money tight, arcades, movie theaters, and sports leagues were luxuries you couldn't afford. This made you incredibly resourceful. Libraries became air-conditioned refugees in summer. Malls were for walking and window shopping. And fast food restaurants offered free soda refills that stretched a single purchase for hours. Free community events, from summer concerts to holiday festivals, were eagerly attended. Everyday objects became toys, cardboard boxes became forts, sticks and rocks became tools for imaginative games, and bike rides turned into all-day adventures. Resourcefulness taught valuable skills: self-entertainment, creativity, and finding joy in simple pleasures. But there was also a sense of being left out. While other kids talked about amusement parks or movies, you had nothing glamorous to share. You learned to deflect questions or act busy, masking the gap between your experiences and theirs. Yet, looking back, many who grew up this way remember those free, inventive childhoods fondly, recognizing the creativity and independence poverty forced them to develop. Fact 11. The phone was rationed by time limits. In the 1980s, phone calls cost money, especially long-distance calls, and poor families had to manage them carefully. Most households had a single shared line, so if one person was on the phone, no one else could use it or receive calls. Phone time was rationed, and kids often had strict limits on how long they could talk to friends. The rules could be peculiar. Some parents used a kitchen timer, allowing 10 or 15 minutes per call, and when it rang, the conversation ended abruptly. Others restricted calls to certain hours, or only after homework was finished. Long-distance calls were nearly forbidden, except for emergencies, and any call to a relative in another state had to be short and essential. This created social challenges. Other kids could chat for hours, but poor kids had to be efficient, getting straight to the point. Phone conversations became functional rather than social. If someone called, you watched the clock nervously, knowing a parent could interrupt. The monthly phone bill was a source of stress. Parents scrutinized charges and sometimes installed locks to prevent unauthorized calls. The phone wasn't a convenience. It was a carefully rationed luxury. Kids today with unlimited cell plans can hardly imagine being timed and monitored simply to save a few dollars. Fact 12. Hand-me-down toys were the norm. Poor kids in the 1980s rarely received new toys. Instead, playtime relied on hand-me-downs from older siblings, garage sale finds, or cast-offs from wealthier families. By the time a toy reached you, it was often missing pieces, broken, or several years out of date. You might get a Star Wars figure without its accessories, a board game missing cards, or a doll with hair cut off. Playing with second-hand toys meant always being a step behind trends. While other kids had the latest G.I. Joe figures from 1987, you might be stuck with 1983 versions. Friends would notice the age or defects. Sometimes you hid flaws, other times you accepted them. Broken toys were better than none. Garage sales were a crucial source. Kids would scour neighborhoods on Saturday mornings, hunting for bargains with $1 or $2 in hand. You learned to spot value, negotiate prices, and make the most of damaged goods. The psychology of hand-me-downs was unusual. Toys weren't truly yours. They had belonged to someone else, and you were just the temporary custodian. New toys on birthdays or Christmas were treasured because they were yours from the start, a rare possession that held a special, almost sacred significance in a childhood otherwise shaped by reuse and improvisation. Fact 13. You ate a lot of creative casseroles. Poor families in the 1980s ate a lot of casseroles, but not the fancy kind from cookbooks. These meals were designed to stretch small amounts of protein and fill multiple people using cheap starches. Moms combined whatever was on hand into a baking dish, creating dinners that were both practical and filling. The weird thing about poverty casseroles was their endless variety and the creative names they acquired: slumgullion, goulash, hot dish, or simply leftovers surprise. A typical casserole might start with ground beef if you were lucky, but more often it used canned tuna, canned chicken, or the mysterious canned meat from commodity boxes. Pasta or rice served as a base. A can of cream soup acted as a binder. Frozen vegetables went in if they were affordable, and the topping might be crushed crackers or potato chips. The result was baked until bubbly and eaten for dinner, then leftovers the next day. These casseroles became family staples. Everyone had favorites like tuna surprise or hamburger casserole. Cooking was functional first, enjoyable second. You ate to be full, using whatever ingredients were cheapest and on hand. Improvisation and resourcefulness were essential. Many who grew up with these dishes still make them today, now celebrated as comfort food rather than a necessity of survival. Fact 14. The library was your entertainment center. For poor kids in the 1980s, the public library was everything: entertainment, education, air-conditioned refuge in summer, and a safe place to spend time. The weird thing was how much time kids spent there. While others watched cable TV, played with new toys, or went on family outings, poor kids were at the library reading books, doing puzzles, and attending every free program offered. The library opened doors to worlds beyond economic limits. Fiction allowed imaginative escape, while non-fiction offered knowledge unavailable at school. Kids often became voracious readers, checking out the maximum number of books, finishing them in days, and returning for more. Librarians got to know regulars, recommending new arrivals, or setting aside favorites. Summer reading programs provided structure, small rewards, and motivation. Free movies, crafts, and other activities filled long days, especially during hot summer weeks, when homes lacked air conditioning. The library was judgment-free. Wealth didn't matter. Rich and poor kids had equal access to books and programs. For many, it was proof that not everything in life was determined by money. Knowledge and stories were freely available, offering escape, education, and inspiration. Many who grew up poor in the 80s credit the library with shaping their curiosity, learning, and imagination during formative years. Fact 15. You knew how to fix everything. Poor families in the 1980s couldn't afford to replace broken items, so kids learned to fix things early. This created a culture of improvisation and repair, shaping how children understood objects and problem solving. If a bike broke, you didn't get a new one. You patched it with duct tape, wire, or whatever was on hand. Ripped jeans were sewn, shoes with holes were stuffed with cardboard. Nothing was disposable. This hands-on experience taught practical skills that wealthier kids often didn't learn until much later. You learned to sew buttons, patch clothes, adjust bike brakes, fix chains, and pump tires by hand. Tools became familiar, and problem-solving became second nature. These lessons weren't taught in school. They were survival knowledge passed down from parents who had also grown up making do. The weird thing about this fix-it culture was the sense of competence it gave kids. While other children might toss a broken toy, poor kids took it apart, diagnosed the problem, and tried to repair it. Success brought pride. Failure brought learning. Riding a Frankenstein bike made from parts salvaged from 3 others, or wearing patched jeans your mother had mended, created a sense of accomplishment. Resourcefulness and resilience were built into daily life, a necessity disguised as childhood skill building. Fact 16. School pictures. Where a once-a-year luxury school picture day in the 1980s was a big deal for every kid. But for poor kids, it was complicated. These were often the only professional photos taken of you all year. Poor families couldn't afford to go to portrait studios or take rolls of film to be developed regularly, so school pictures were it. The weird thing was that many poor families couldn't even afford to buy the school pictures, which created an awkward situation where you'd get your photo taken but never receive copies. Picture day meant wearing your best outfit, which for poor kids might be the same outfit you wore for special occasions all year. Your mom would try to make sure your hair looked good and your clothes were clean and unwrinkled. You'd line up with everyone else, sit on the stool in front of the backdrop, and smile for the photographer. Then weeks later, the pictures would come back, and you'd watch other kids excitedly opening their photo packets while you got nothing, or at best, the free wallet-size photos that came with the basic package. Some poor families would scrape together money to buy the smallest package, usually just the class photo and a sheet of wallet-sized pictures. The expensive packages with the big 8x10 portraits and multiple poses were out of the question. This meant you couldn't participate in the trading of school photos that happened among classmates. Other kids would hand out their wallet photos to friends, writing messages on the back, and you'd have nothing to trade. You'd receive photos from other kids but couldn't reciprocate, which made you feel like you were taking without giving. The awkwardness of picture day was compounded by the order forms that went home with students. These forms showed all the different packages available, ranging from affordable to expensive. Your parents would look at the cheapest option and still struggle to afford it. Sometimes they'd write a check they knew would stretch the budget. Other times they'd just not order anything, and you'd have to return the form with nothing checked off. The photographer would still take your picture for the class composite, but you'd know you wouldn't be getting any individual photos. What made school pictures particularly weird for poor kids was how they documented your poverty. If you owned only 1 or 2 nice outfits, you'd wear the same thing in your school picture year after year. Looking back at a series of school photos, you'd see yourself in the same shirt or dress repeatedly. Other kids would have variety in their photos, different outfits each year, but yours would show the same limited wardrobe cycling through. It was a visual record of having less, preserved in those awkward school portraits that captured you at your most self-conscious age, wearing your only good clothes. Fact 17. Christmas meant layaway and hope. Christmas in the 1980s was a time of enormous pressure for poor families. The commercial aspects of the holiday were ramping up. Advertising was constant, and kids were seeing all the toys they wanted on TV and in catalogs. Poor parents faced the impossible challenge of trying to give their kids a good Christmas without the money to do it. This created weird traditions and strategies that defined how poor families experienced the holiday season. Layaway was crucial for poor families at Christmas. Starting in September or October, parents would go to stores like Kmart or Walmart and put toys on layaway. They'd make small payments over several months, hoping to have everything paid off by Christmas. The weird thing about layaway was that it was simultaneously hopeful and precarious. You were planning ahead and being responsible, but there was always the risk that something would happen, and you couldn't make all the payments. If that occurred, you'd lose the items, and sometimes even the money you'd already paid in fees. Poor kids often had very different Christmas mornings than their classmates. While some kids would have trees surrounded by dozens of wrapped presents, poor kids might get a few gifts, often practical items like clothes or shoes, along with maybe one toy they'd really wanted. Parents would apologize for the small haul, and kids would try to be grateful while feeling the gap between their Christmas and the ones they'd seen on TV or heard about from friends. The presents you did get would be treasured intensely because they represented real sacrifice from your parents. What made Christmas weird for poor families was the contrast between the cultural message that Christmas was magical and abundant and the reality of scarcity. You'd watch commercials showing families with perfect decorations and mountains of gifts. And then look at your own modest tree with its secondhand ornaments and small pile of presents. Schools would have kids write essays about what they got for Christmas, and poor kids would have to decide whether to tell the truth about their few gifts or embellish to avoid embarrassment. Some families couldn't afford gifts at all and had to rely on charity programs like Toys for Tots, which helped but also reinforced the feeling of being less than others. Fact 18. You never threw anything away. Poor families in the 1980s had a keep-everything mentality that created homes full of saved items. You never threw away jars, bags, twist ties, rubber bands, or anything else that might possibly be useful someday. The weird thing about this wasn't just the saving itself, but the elaborate systems families developed for organizing and storing all these saved items. Kitchen drawers would be full of carefully folded plastic bags. Cabinets would hold rows of empty jars. Closets would contain boxes of potential future uses. This saving mentality extended to everything. Wrapping paper from presents would be carefully removed and folded to use again next year. Aluminum foil would be washed and reused. Plastic containers from margarine or yogurt would become food storage. Worn-out clothing would be saved for rags. Broken items would be kept for parts. Nothing had just one use. Everything could be repurposed, and throwing something away felt wasteful because you could. Imagine a scenario where you might need it. What made this hoarding tendency weird was how it reflected constant scarcity thinking. When you're poor, you never know when you might need something and not be able to afford to buy it. So you save everything just in case. This created homes that were cluttered but also resourceful. Need a container? There were dozens of saved margarine tubs. Need a bag? There was a plastic bag full of plastic bags. Need rubber bands? There was a ball of them in the junk drawer. Poor families had their own mini supply stores built from saved items. The psychological impact of never throwing anything away was complex. On one hand, it taught frugality and creativity in reusing items. Poor kids learned to see potential in things others would discard. On the other hand, it created a sense that you could never relax about resources. Even as adults, people who grew up poor in the 80s often struggle to throw things away, feeling anxiety about wasting anything or not being prepared for future need. The keep everything mentality was both practical survival strategy and symptom of living in constant economic uncertainty. Fact 19. Birthday parties. Happened at home. Birthday parties for poor kids in the 1980s were very different from the elaborate celebrations that were becoming popular. While some kids were having parties at Pizza Hut or Chuck E. Cheese or roller skating rinks, poor kids had parties at home with homemade cake and simple games. The weird thing about these parties wasn't that they were at home, which was traditional, but how the gap between home parties and venue parties was widening during this decade. A typical poor kid birthday party would involve inviting a few friends over to your house or apartment. Your mom would bake a cake from a box mix, not from a bakery. Decorations would be minimal, maybe some streamers or balloons from the dollar store. Activities would be traditional games like pin the tail on the donkey or musical chairs, things that required no purchased entertainment. If you were lucky, you might go to a park for your party, which was free and gave everyone more space to run around. The social dynamics of birthday parties revealed economic differences. When you attended parties at venues, you saw what money could buy. Arcade games, pizza, party hosts who organized everything, goodie bags full of toys and candy. Then your own birthday would come, and you'd have friends over to your house where the entertainment was whatever you could think up, and the food was whatever your mom could afford to make. Some kids would compare parties, noting who had the best or biggest celebration, and poor kids would feel that comparison keenly. What made birthday parties particularly weird was the gift expectation. When you were invited to someone else's party, you were expected to bring a gift, which poor families struggled to afford. Your parents might give you $10 or $15 to buy something, and you'd go to Kmart trying to find the perfect gift within that budget. Meanwhile, when it was your birthday, you'd receive gifts of varying value, and you'd notice which friends brought expensive toys and which brought modest ones. The entire social ritual of birthday parties was laden with economic indicators that kids picked up on even if they couldn't articulate what they were noticing.
Make a wish, dear, and blow out the candles.
Here they go!
Fact 20. You learned money lessons. Early, poor kids in the 1980s learned about money earlier and more viscerally than their wealthier peers. The weird thing about this wasn't just knowing about financial constraints, but understanding adult economic stress as a child. You'd hear your parents arguing about bills, you'd notice when they were worried, and you'd learn to not ask for things because you knew the answer would be no, and it would cause your parents pain to have to say it. This early financial awareness created a strange maturity in poor kids. You'd understand concepts like overdraft fees, disconnection notices, and payment plans before you hit middle school. You'd know what government assistance programs your family used and feel a mixture of gratitude for them and shame about needing them. You'd calculate costs in your head, knowing how many hours your parent had to work to afford something, and you'd decide most things weren't worth asking for. This wasn't knowledge that was explicitly taught. It was absorbed through living in economic precarity. Poor kids also learned to manage money carefully when they did have it. If you got birthday money or allowance or earned money from odd jobs, you'd think hard about how to spend it. You'd comparison shop, waiting for sales, and you'd save for things you really wanted rather than making impulse purchases. This gave you financial literacy, but also a scarcity mentality that was hard to shake. Even as adults, people who grew up poor often have complex relationships with money, simultaneously good at budgeting and anxious about spending. What made money lessons weird for poor kids was that you were learning adult realities while still being a child. You'd comfort your parents when bills were overwhelming. You'd feel responsible for financial stress that wasn't yours to carry. You'd make decisions based on money that kids shouldn't have to make, like skipping school trips because you knew your family couldn't afford them, or lying about why you couldn't do activities that cost money. This premature awareness shaped how poor kids understood the world and their place in it. Being poor in the 1980s had its own unique character, shaped by the era's government programs, consumer culture, and technological limitations. The experiences described here aren't meant to romanticize poverty, which was and remains difficult and limiting. But there's value in remembering what it was actually like, in acknowledging these weird facts that shaped millions of childhoods. Poor kids from the 80s learned resilience, resourcefulness, and creativity out of necessity. They developed skills that served them as adults, even as they carried wounds from economic exclusion and shame. The 1980s are often remembered nostalgically, but that nostalgia tends to focus on the positive aspects and the middle-class experience. For poor families, the decade looked different. It was government cheese and commodity food boxes and colored lunch tickets. It was fixing everything, wearing hand-me-downs, and learning to find free entertainment. It was watching other kids have things you couldn't have, and developing coping strategies to deal with that gap. It was loving parents who did their best with limited resources and kids who learned to appreciate small things because they were all they had. If you grew up poor in the 1980s, you carry these experiences with you. They shaped how you think about money, value, and resourcefulness. They taught you to make do, to fix things, to find free options, and to appreciate stability when you finally achieved it. These weird facts about poverty in the 80s are more than historical curiosities. They're lived experiences that formed a generation, teaching lessons that continue to resonate decades later. Let me know in the comments if you remember any of these experiences, and make sure to sign up for the newsletter for more looks back at what life was really like during different decades.